You hear this term transformational adaptation a lot. I'm not entirely sure, or I'm not an expert enough to see whether this concept is another fuzzy concept or whether it actually has some meat behind it. You know, if it's a discursive kind of a descriptor that says this was transformational adaptation and that was incremental, is there any index, a quantitative measure to say which is transformational and which is not? That's always tricky. So let's just read this in terms of, just making the discussion complete. Well, we cannot have a course on adaptation and not discuss transformational adaptation separately, right? So I'm going to take material from a few papers and just read the main points. Transformational adaptation when incremental adaptations to climate change are insufficient. Okay, this is an older paper from 2012, but I'm putting it in new findings just because it didn't belong in the main flow of material from the various sources that I took. All human environment systems, I should emphasize it differently, all human environment systems adapt to climate and its natural variation. Adaptation to human-induced change in climate has largely been envisioned as increments of these adaptations intended to avoid disruptions of systems at their current locations. So we talked about adaptation of humans through the Holocene, which is presumably natural climate change. Now we are talking about adaptations to human-induced climate change, even though Bill Rediman would argue that we have been changing climate via agriculture through the Holocene anyways. In some places, for some systems, however, vulnerabilities and risks may be so sizable that they require transformational rather than incremental adaptations. Three classes of transformational adaptations are those that are adopted at a much larger scale, that are truly new to a particular region or resource system, and that transform places and shift locations. There you go. So that's one definition. We illustrate these with examples drawn from Africa, Europe, and North America. Examples are always good. Two conditions set the stage for transformational adaptation to climate change: large vulnerability in certain regions, populations, or resource systems, and severe climate change that overwhelms even robust human use systems. However, anticipatory transformational adaptation may be difficult to implement because of uncertainties about climate change risks and adaptation benefits, the high costs of transformational actions, and institutional and behavioral actions that tend to maintain existing resource systems and policies. Implementing transformational adaptation requires effort to initiate it and then to sustain the effort over time. In initiating transformational adaptation, focusing events and multiple stresses are important, combined with local leadership. In sustaining transformational adaptation, it seems likely that supportive social contexts and the availability of acceptable options and resources for actions are key enabling factors. Early steps would include incorporating transformational adaptation into risk management and initiating research to expand the menu of innovative transformational adaptations. So planning is necessary, resources are necessary, preparing the people for transformation is very critical, and of course protecting livelihoods, lives, infrastructure, public services, etc. are critical as well. Moving to another paper, this is a review article, From Incremental to Transformative Adaptation in Individual Responses to Climate Exacerbated Hazards. So this is maybe a proper way to say it, climate exacerbated hazards. So we are basically amplifying naturally occurring hazards in most cases. And here you can see already that instead of transformational, this is using transformative adaptation. Building societal resilience to climate change depends on increased adaptation. In this review, Scholarship on Behavioral Adaptation, we find that most empirical studies focus on the effective and cognitive drivers of behaviors with largely private benefits. Affective is a psychological term. If it's not intuitively obvious, I should quickly read a definition so that before moving forward we have some sense of what it is. Okay, so if I Google what is affective, what comes up? It says in psychology relating to moods, feelings and attitudes. In psychiatry, it means denoting or relating to mental conditions in which disturbance of mood or its expression is the primary component, like affective disorders. Okay, so in this context, of course, affective and cognitive drivers of behavior include all these things. Okay, just to quickly look at the criteria for incremental versus transformative adaptation. Incremental adaptations have low intensity impact. This is high intensity. Again, is it qualitative or quantitative? Small scale, large scale, qualitative, quantitative, short term, long term, standard, innovative. How do you define these things? Individual costs, individual and collective costs, individual benefits, individual and collective benefits. That may be more easily quantified. Supporting coping versus supports resilience. So it's not just reactive and survival mode, guardrail mode, but it's actually building resilience. Okay, the characteristics of incremental and transformative adaptation are neither exhaustive nor exclusive. A behavior can be evaluated based on the number of criteria it meets as well as the degree to which it meets each one. Each criterion row should be judged within the context in which the behavior is presented. For example, innovativeness must take into account the current practice wherein the behavior occurred. So it is innovative with respect to a baseline, basically. Okay, so this is a more expansive table. So we are looking at incremental, transformative for the individual and household versus incremental with the potential to be transformative for the society and transformative for the society by design. Okay, so few examples: moving valuables to a safer place in the home in a flood-prone area, buying flood insurance, storing food and other items for emergencies, making household evacuation plan, and so on are incremental. If you go to transformative with potential advantage for society, but definitely for individuals and households, so they are transformative for individual and household, or incremental with the potential to be transformative for society. So undertaking voluntary migration, so you get out of the vulnerable regions like building on a slope, etc., subject to landslides, installing a rain garden to reduce stormwater runoff, moving agricultural operations to a more appropriate climate, changing one's identity by adopting a new livelihood or growing a new crop, reducing water use through exeriscaping or using drought tolerant plants. That's a very specific term that I'm not going to get into here. Reducing water consumption in one's home, and then you also have removing flood barriers in own community to reduce risk of flooding downstream. So you have potential for transformative adaptation for society. Checking on elderly neighbors or volunteering in emergency areas during a heat wave, assisting in efforts to increase the use of prescribed fire to reduce fuel connectivity at a large scale. So this is about managing forests for wildfires and so on. So here they are mostly personal benefits, and here you're transcending and going personal and collective benefits, with being potentially transformative for the society. Some more here. Behaviors below may impose externalities and be maladaptive at scale. Behaviors above do not impose such potential negative externalities. So these are the ones here. What are the those that impose externalities and can become maladaptive at scale? Installing air conditioning in response to increased temperatures has global warming impacts, so benefits individuals but can have externalities of increasing greenhouse gases and may become maladaptive at scale. If everybody buys air conditioning, then you have other issues of energy demands, energy system failures, etc. Purchasing flood barriers for private property, drilling a new well in response to water scarcity, so groundwater mining and just deflecting water to somebody like a neighbor's property and so on. Transformative for society, contributing to political engagement to reduce vulnerability of municipal water infrastructure, societal level. Initiating eco-villages with green infrastructure that attracts residents with pro-social values. There is ideas of intrinsic and extrinsic personalities, people who care about themselves versus people who have pro-social values, people who care about power and image versus stand up for causes of collective benefits, and so on. Engaging in planning processes to shift from irrigation agriculture to tourism-based economy in response to groundwater depletion. That's definitely transformative. Working with an NGO to engage policymakers in ways that challenge and disrupt dominant social relations to produce a more sustainable future, and so on. Okay, so that's the review article. This one is a nice Wire article which you should read. Transformational responses to climate change beyond a system's perspective of social change in mitigation and adaptation. So this is broader in perspective in terms of social change, and look at not just adaptation but also mitigation and going beyond systems perspectives. Okay. Lots of text, but let's read it just for fun. There is a growing imperative for response to climate change to go beyond incremental adjustments, aiming instead for society-wide transformation. In this context, socio-technical transitions and socio-technical transitions and social ecological resilience are two prominent normative agendas. Normative is basically rules based, and you have norms to be followed, and if you don't follow there could be punishments and so on. Reviewing these literatures reveals how both share a complex system epistemology with inherent limitations, often that's basically origin of the knowledge, often producing managerial governance recommendations and foregrounding material over social drivers of change. Further interdisciplinary dialogue with social theory is essential if these frameworks are to become more theoretically robust and capable of informing effective, let alone transformational climate change governance. To illustrate this potential, ideas from Deleuze and Guattari's political writings, as well as other approaches that utilize the notion social fields as opposed to social systems, are combined to more fully theorize the origins and enactment of social change. So this is a very theoretical kind of discussion here. First, the logic of systems is replaced with the contingency of assemblages to reveal how pluralism and not elitism can produce more ambitious and politicized visions of the future that implies participation, agency, pluralism, etc. In particular, this view encourages us to see social and ecological tensions as opportunities for thinking and acting differently rather than as mere technical problems to be solved. So if you always rely on technical and economic feasibilities to see problems and trying to solve them instead of thinking and acting differently, then you end up in a different directions and pathways. Secondly, the setting of social fields is introduced to situate and explain the power of ideas and the role of agency in times of uncertainty. People's ability and willingness to participate and opportunity to participate are important. The potential of such insights is already visible in some strands of climate change mitigation and adaptation research, but more needs to be done to advance this field and to bring it into the dialogue with the mainstream systems-based literature. Okay. Conclusion. So I'm going to jump to conclusion and conclude this. Lot of text here, so not sure if I'll read the whole thing. Transformational social change can be said to involve a broad set of interrelated processes, practical, political, and personal in nature. In the context of climate change, mitigation and adaptation, two prominent agendas, socio-technical transitions and socio-ecological resilience both utilize a systems perspective to address some of these issues. However, certain conceptual blind spots, particularly regarding politics, power, agency, and ideas, have not only limited the scope of their analysis but have also led to problematic governance prescriptions. So how rules and regulations, codes of conduct, not only for people but buildings and so on are set up can depend on how well the analysis is done. Whilst some strands of TM, transformative and adaptive co-management, do acknowledge the existence of competing visions for a climate compatible future, in general, there is a tendency to try to control this potentially creative force through a process of isomorphism, managerialist steering, and consensus building. Maybe this is a little too much of social science jargon than we want, but nonetheless, jumping here, in response, we may turn to social theories where power, politics, and social relations are of central concern for insights and provocations. Okay, let's jump to the end. Immediately, critical questions emerge around why some mitigation and adaptation actions are successful or not, and to what extent they're capable of driving transformational change. Or in other words, whose vision of a climate compatible future is being pursued and along which pathways? This is a very important question. You know, who is leading adaptation? Mitigation is already a big problem, especially when it comes to tinkering with solar radiation management, which is, which can have unintended consequences in terms of perturbation to rainfall distributions, crop damages, droughts, and so on. So who is in charge and who will be left standing watching from the sidelines without any say in their future? So how are we colonizing the future with these ideas of adaptation and mitigation, especially when they become scaled to larger and larger regions? So those are important questions that are normative and analytical, strategic, and so on. So let me clarify one thing here in a second. Yeah, it's important to understand that TM is transition management. So we are basically in a system that is set up since Industrial Revolution in many ways, and people have adapted to it. Even the developing world has, adopted technologies, and even various consumption patterns like jeans are everywhere, sneakers are everywhere, and so on. And we are talking about transitioning to a new system, in this case talking about transformational adaptation to new systems, maybe changing livelihoods, being displaced forcefully or voluntarily, and so on. So transition management and adaptive management become very critical. Adaptive management is learning by doing, where you do things and you adjust your governance structures, rules and regulations, and inclusion of people, stakeholders, etc. But of course, again, the question is whose vision of climate compatible future is being pursued, and what are the pathways we are following to get there? Are they all the same? Do we get from A to B? Is it the same if we get from one pathway, go through one pathway of, let's say, energy, ecology, biodiversity protection, equality, justice, and agency, and so on, versus another pathway which gets you to the same point but different pathways? So we have to worry about all these sorts of details. So I will leave the transformational adaptation here for now. If there is any new information that I find in the literature, then I will add podcasts maybe as supplements to this. Okay.